Let me then start the talk. Sharon is a professor at the Centre for the Study of Theory and Criticism at the University of Western University in Canada. My apologies.
We changed our name.
And author of The Human Rights in Camera. There's a more extensive bibliography in the booklet.
Thank you. I did want to say thank you first to Tom and Trinidad and Suhail for this spectacular invitation. It's really an honor to be amongst this company. And thank you as well to Maya. I don't know if Maya's in the room. No, but I'll thank her later. Just one note to begin this paper that I'm going to ask. It's a paper that requires a bit of courage. It'll require a bit of courage for me to read this first part, and I suspect it'll be difficult for you to hear the first part, but I'm hoping for courage for you too. Okay. On July 3rd, 1992, witness 87, whose real name is protected by the mandate of the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. The acronym is the ICTY. I'll just use the acronym from now on. Witness 87 found herself hiding in the woods. She was 15 years old. She and her family, her mother, father, sister, and brother, had recently fled their home near Foca, a town that has long sat on the banks of the Drina River. In 1992, Foca consisted of some 40,000 residents, the majority of whom were Muslim. The Bosnian War reached the town in April of 1992, although Witness 87's family managed to avoid its reach by hiding in makeshift tents in the nearby woods. But early on the morning of July 3rd, Serbian soldiers appeared, rounding up several of the families and taking them to a clearing, separating the men from the women and the children. July 3rd was the last day Witness 87 saw her father. She reports hearing gunshots, and it is her belief that he was murdered on that day. The Serbian soldiers took the women and children to a boarding house in Foca called Buk Bajila. There they were lined up against a wall and told to wait. Eventually more soldiers came and called out names or simply pointed to them with their fingers, taking the women and girls one by one to smaller rooms for questioning. Witness 87 was taken by the hand by a man named Pero. He took her to a small, dirty room in order to take her clothes off. When she made no movement, he removed her clothes himself, and then he raped her. 8 years later, when asked by the prosecution at the UN tribunal to describe exactly what Pero did, Witness 87 replied, "It's a little difficult for me. Well, what I mean is he had sexual relations, forcibly. Against my will, he had sexual relations with me." The details afterwards are hazy. She has trouble accessing this memory. It was as if I wasn't present, conscious of it at all, what was happening to me. She does remember Pero eventually brought her to another room where she was questioned about the inhabitants of her village. They asked if she was a virgin. When she answered that she was until a few moments ago, she was ordered to take her clothes off again, whereupon 4 more soldiers raped her, some of whom she recognized. They eventually took her to a bus where the other girls and women were waiting, including Witness 87's mother. Mrs. Kuau, the prosecuting lawyer, this is just one page from the transcript of the ICTY trial, so you can see this, just have a sense of what the document looks like. I don't know if you can read it. Mrs. Kuau, the prosecuting lawyer, asked if she told her mother what had just happened to her. Answer, no. Question, why not? Answer, I think at that time I didn't have enough strength to even look her in the eyes. Not only her, but anybody, to look anybody in the eyes. Question, how did you feel at that time? Answer, it's very difficult to describe that. I know that I was terribly frightened, that I felt ashamed in a way, and in a way I felt very, very dirty, soiled. The bus took the women and the girls to Nikola Tesla Secondary School in a district of Foca called Aladza. This was the school that Witness 87 was attending at the time. They were held in a classroom on the first floor in which there were no chairs or desks. 2 weeks passed. The women slept on gym mats. Serb soldiers turned up at night, picking out girls and taking them to other classrooms. Sometimes Witness 87 and others would be taken from the school to nearby houses and raped. Sometimes they were beaten or cut with knives. One of the men that regularly raped Witness 87 in the school was called Zoran Vukovic. She did not know him before the war. Vukovic once told another one of the girls, Witness 50, that if she was not the same age as his own daughter, he would have done much worse things to her. Vukovic was one of the 3 men that the UN tribunal prosecuted for rape as a crime against humanity. After some 2 weeks in the school, Witness 87 and others were moved to the Partizan Sports Hall, a building that Judge Florence Mumba noted in her summary judgment was a stone's throw from the local police station. The routine here was the same as at the school. Soldiers would come at night and take certain girls to nearby houses. At one stretch, Witness 87 and a handful of others were taken to a place she called Karaman's house, where she was kept for 2 months. The doors of this house had no handles on the outside, just a keyhole. The girls were raped every night, or if they were lucky, every other night. When asked to give a number as to how many times she was raped in Karaman's house, Witness 97 replied, "I don't think that's possible." One of the girls that passed through this house was just 12. In her testimony, Witness 87 told the court it was not long before this girl began displaying signs of psychosis. After a Serbian soldier sold her for 200 German marks, she was never seen again. By the end of September, or perhaps the beginning of October 1992, Witness 87, along with 3 other girls, was taken to yet another apartment, kept this time on the 4th floor of the Brina building in Foka. There they were kept as domestic and sexual servants for 4 months. Every orifice of their bodies was made available to the soldiers. On at least 2 occasions, the girls were forced to strip and to dance on a table for the amusements of the Serb soldiers. On one of these occasions, a soldier named Radomir Kovac threatened to take them through the town naked and then to the river where he would kill them. One night he did indeed take them to the river. Witness 87 was unable to recount many details from that night. Occasionally the girls were dressed in clothing marked with Serbian army insignias and brought to the cafes and coffee bars of Foka. Witness 87 reports that she had suicidal thoughts throughout these months. Her nightmare deepened again when she and another girl were sold to 2 soldiers from Montenegro for 500 German marks each. They were transported over the border and held in yet another apartment in Nikšić. There they worked without wages as waitresses in a coffee bar by day and as sexual servants by night. They eventually escaped by hiding their tips and buying bus tickets. Witness 87 escaped in the spring of 1993, almost a full year after her initial capture. Near the end of her testimony, the prosecuting lawyer, Mrs. Kuau, asked Witness 87 if she still suffered as a result of all the rapes from all those months in captivity. She answers, "In a way, yes. I think that once again, I am at a point where I find it difficult to explain. I think that I have decided to try and leave many of those things behind me somewhere, although within me, I still have, and always there will be traces of everything that happened to me." This particular spectacle of sovereign violence that seeks to leave its traces on the body, indeed which seeks more precisely to alienate a subject from being able to inhabit their own body by forcibly invading its interiority, returned again 2 years later in Rwanda in the summer of 1994. There was the Hutu militia, inflamed by the rhetoric of an ethnic sovereignty who sought to purge their nation of its undesirable elements. In this case, too, it was women's bodies that bore the brunt of this chillingly rational contract that is the dark underbelly of natural law. Individuals exercise their right, de jure, to use at will the violence that is, de facto, at their disposal. In Rwanda, as in the former Yugoslavia, this law-making violence had a particularly potent corporeal force and a certain theatrical dimension. After being forced to witness the murder of their husbands and sons and the destruction of their homes, Tutsi women were raped, often gang-raped, as an integral part of the genocidal logic. According to many witnesses, rape was often followed by sexual mutilation and finally murder. One 25-year-old survivor, Denise, had been married for just 2 months when the militia came to her house on April 20th, 1994. Her husband fled, but she remained behind, thinking that they would not harm her. 6 Hutu militiamen came to her house with machetes and torches, some of whom she recognized as her neighbors. They demanded to know the whereabouts of her husband. When she refused to answer, they began to beat her with sticks. One of them raped her. He said, "You're lucky. Your God is still with you because we don't want to kill you. Now the Hutu have won. You Tutsi, we're going to exterminate you. You won't own anything." When he finished, he took Denise inside to a bed. He held one leg open, and another man held the other. He called everyone who was outside and said, "You come see how Tutsikazi are on the inside." Then he said, "You Tutsikazi, you think you are the only beautiful woman in the world." He cut out the inside of her vagina, and he took this flesh outside and mounted it on a stick at the door of Denise's house. He shouted, "Everyone who comes past here will see how Tutsikazi look." It's difficult to read in the first person sometimes. The militiamen continued to beat her. Denise survived by crawling to a neighbor's house where she hid for a month until she was able to walk. She did not receive medical treatment. She reported her case to local authorities on 3 occasions with no response. When she heard of the United Nations Tribunal, she traveled to one of their centers to give her testimony. I hope you're feeling by now something of the awful force of this spectacle of sexual violence. As much as one might wish to avert one's gaze and guard one's heart from this almost unthinkable human cruelty, my aim, make no mistake, is to restage these scenes precisely so something of their force can be felt. Surely what is at stake in working with these testimonies is negotiating their belated effects, engaging head-on the question of what it means to transmit and to theorize around a crisis that cannot be given as direct knowledge, but simultaneously defies and commands our witness. So we have, then, 2 different scenes from 2 different parts of the world, separated by less than 2 years. They are events that occurred at a time when a new international discourse of human rights and humanitarianism was being championed, when disaster relief had been established as an instrument as much as a goal of international politics. Indeed, this was the era of the so-called New International, a time in which the world found itself thrown after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of European communism. Among the myriad differences between these 2 scenes, we should remember that the Bosnian War was widely covered in the international press. Roy Gutman's dispatches were appearing regularly in Newsday. Even Susan Sontag had time to make a pilgrimage to Sarajevo and get really angry at Andrei Glucksmann. Meanwhile, the Rwandan genocide was almost completely eclipsed in the media, in part by the triumphal story of the end of apartheid and the transition of power in South Africa. My aim in attending these scenes and in setting them within further scenes is to consider this spectacle of sexual violence as an integral aspect of sovereign power. This claim is somewhat a slant to a dominant strand of scholarship on sovereignty. Michel Foucault, as you may recall, begins Discipline and Punish with an extended description of the last person to be drawn and quartered in France, regicide, Robert François Damiens, in 1757. His painful blow-by-blow account is meant to demonstrate the disappearance of such public spectacles of torture. Throughout modernity, Foucault's argument goes, the torture of the condemned has not only ceased, but more precisely has receded from public view. This disappearance of the spectacle execution, he insists, marks the decline of sovereign interest in the spectacle itself, but also, as he puts it, a slackening hold on the body. With the advent of modernity, the state no longer touched the body, he writes, or at least as little as possible, and then only to reach something other than the body itself. This was affected by the introduction of new apparatuses that could express the abstract intention of the law. The guillotine, for instance, takes life, Foucault writes, almost without touching the body. It is intended to apply the law not so much to a real body capable of feeling pain as to a juridical subject, the possessor, among other rights, of the right to exist. And the emergence of such instruments, the theorist argument goes, marks the moment when politics turns into biopolitics. And just as an aside, this is Goya, of course, and part of and this wasn't in the paper originally, so I thought I'd say a few things about the pictures, but Goya was kind of where my thinking on this topic began, because of course in the disasters of war, there is an extended, which happened right around the turn of the century, kind of 1808 or so, they're being produced. There is an extended series on sexual violence. And it's one of the first times in the history of art that we have very clear, I don't know what to call it, resistance. I mean, here you have a woman in a classic position of protest. She's a supplicant. This is like an early example of no means no, like, please don't. I mean, the captions of the sequence of 3 is that they do not want to. So it's a kind of a firm statement in this case, and even in Goya's time. And then, just to go on a long aside, as opposed to a short one, I was at a great exhibition of Otto Dix's work in Montreal, and fascinated by his series called Der Krieg, homage to Goya. It's 50 etchings long. But what was interesting in the show in Montreal is that they had included an excised image, an image that was not originally included in the print run. So if you go to MoMA or you go to any of the big institutions that have copies of Der Krieg, you will not find this image. And it's because, oops, maybe I don't even have the image. There. It's called Soldat und Nun, Soldier and Nun. And it's because Dix's publisher, the very last minute, you can see he published several copies of it, pulled it from the series. And so my question began, well, why, of all the things that Dix is presenting to us, is this the thing that we cannot see? That why is this the thing that is disavowed? And so it became the kind of the question that drove the paper in a way, even though it's not necessarily in the paper. And then, of course, this representation of this act is in full view. This is from the gardens outside the Louvre, of course. Okay. To be sure, Foucault's chief interest was in the history of systems of punishment, the birth of the prison, rather than in the breaks and outbreaks of violence, which is to say, his study is focused on the law-preserving rather than law-making forms of sovereign power, to borrow Walter Benjamin's important distinction. Nevertheless, the harrowing scenes I described would seem to demand an amendment, or perhaps better, a caveat, to Foucault's thesis that sovereignty has slowly grown disinterested in addressing itself to the body directly. The caveat goes something like this. The technologies and representatives of state power have never lost their interest in touching certain bodies. And further, the political investment in the body has not only been bound up with its abstractly economic use, which is to say labor power, but also quite literally with sex. If there is a political anatomy, as Foucault so provocatively proposes, the inverse figure of the king's body with its surplus power is not only the condemned man, as Foucault argues, but also, and perhaps more accurately, the condemned woman. The ceremonies and rituals that surround the crown seem to have their shadowy underside in the vagina, or at least in the signifier of this bodily organ whose symbolic capital, as the testimony horrifyingly displays, is attacked directly. Indeed, it can be sundered in times of war. If Foucault's enduring legacy was to open the door to an analysis of the concrete ways in which power penetrates subjects' bodies and forms of life, then the events in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, and the international tribunals that followed, ask us to attend to the particulars of those bodies and forms of life all the more closely. Indeed, to grapple with the disquieting fact that the chief suturing force of sovereign power, the primal scene, if you will, is sexual. The two UN tribunals, and especially ICTY's willingness to grapple with these particulars of the body, have paved the way for an important transformation in international law. For the first time in history, an international criminal court heard a case based solely on claims of sexual violence. And on February 22nd, 2001, the first year of the third millennium, the court found 3 Serbian soldiers, Drago Jub Kunarik, Radomir Kovac, and Zoran Vukovic, guilty of rape as a crime against humanity. As Deborah Berghofen puts it, by legitimating women's epistemic authority and by creating a new human right, the right to sexual self-determination, the ICTY validated the dignity of the vulnerable body. This court drew, for sure, its precedent from the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which is the first international treaty to name sexual violence among its list of war crimes. But it bears emphasizing that no such charges were logged at the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War. No such charges were brought to Tokyo either, despite a profusion of testimony about the sexual violence committed by Japanese forces in Nanking, among other Chinese cities. And in this respect, the 2001 ruling is a landmark event, not only because it specifically named rape as a crime against humanity, but also because it took the step to actually develop the jurisprudence to prosecute the crime. But differently, this was the first moment in which that interminable relationship between war and sex, or thanatos and eros, as Freud might say, was acknowledged and investigated on an international scale. If interminable seems like too strong a word, consider old Nestor's speech from the Iliad, in which the grizzled general tries to rouse his war-weary soldiers prior to their assault on Troy. He says, "Let none make haste to go until he has first lain with the wife of some Trojan, and for revenge the toil and sorrow that he has suffered for the sake of Helen." The 2001 ruling was subsequently picked up by the International Criminal Court, the ICC, and has effectively been incorporated into international humanitarian law. According to the Rome Statute that legitimated the International Criminal Court, rape is the forced physical invasion of the body. It is considered a crime against humanity when it becomes deployed as a widespread or systemic practice. As with the ICTY ruling, the International Criminal Court distinguishes rape through the principle of consent. When a perpetrator invades the body of the victim without the victim's genuine voluntary permission. This act can cause pain, injury, infertility, disease, unwanted pregnancy, and even death. But what makes it a crime against humanity is the severing effect it can have on the subject's relationship to the human condition. Rape can spawn a form of social death, loss of the individual's identity and vitality, which can consequently engender a grave crisis of existence. Deployed on a widespread scale, it not only disrupts families, but broader social networks, indeed whole communities. And in this respect, war rape violates much more than the body of the victim, even though the body, and in particular the body's interiority, remains the principal site of the violence. These atrocious events, and the prosecution of them, quicken any number of crucial issues around that should intervene upon and guide our contemporary thinking about human rights. There is not time today to conduct a proper excursus, so let me just single out 4 overlapping sets of questions that beg further discussion. First is the way that war rape functions as a genocidal strategy. I'm pressing upon a kind of structuralist critique, I suppose. I'm interested in its function. From documents that date from the latter part of 1991, at a meeting in which the Yugoslav army met to discuss the so-called RAM report, which was one of the kind of mandates of the war, it's clear that the Yugoslav army deliberately targeted Muslim women, and especially adolescents and children, as part of their psychological strategy of war. As the minutes from one of their meetings report, this is a quotation, "Decisive intervention on these societal figures would spread confusion among the communities, thus causing fear and then panic, leading to the probable retreat from the territories involved in war activity." And then in a letter sent to the chief of the secret police in Belgrade, one of the commanders of the Yugoslav army notes that 1,680 Muslim women of ages ranging from 12 to 60 are now gathered in the centers for displaced persons within our territory. A large number of these are pregnant, and in our estimation, the psychological effect is strong, and therefore we must continue. So part of the Yugoslav's army, their war activity, therefore, involved raping Muslim women with the intention of impregnating them. The implicit logic is twofold, that the children of these sexual assaults would be considered Serbian, which is to say that the mother's ethnicity is irrelevant. Ethnicity travels paternally, at least in this part of the world. And second, that there was an awareness that women's bodies suture the social fabric. Attacking those bodies would accomplish ethnic cleansing because it unravels group cohesion. Or to switch metaphors, polluting women's bodies contaminates the future of the community, rendering it unfit for further cultural or biological production. My second point is distinguishing the function of rape from the function of torture. Kunarik, Kovac, and Vukovic were each found guilty of rape as a crime against humanity, but also of torture as a crime against humanity, among other charges. The distinction that this court makes between these two acts was new, and it is significant. As any number of scholars have argued, and there's a huge growing literature on torture, and as the court reinforced, torture aims to inflict pain to a degree that all other sentient experience is eclipsed. And it also aims to manipulate the tortured subject's relationship to speech. One of the aims of torture is the production of a certain kind of truth in the form of a confession. The status of this truth is performative. The torturer uses his victim's signature to authorize his own sovereign power. This is a ventriloquist's trick, hollowing out the subjectivity of the victim only in order to fill it with the torturer's speech, and in so doing exploiting and ruining the human being's fundamental freedom to assign meaning to the world. The ICTY distinguished rape from this forced confession, and instead of the production of speech, it decided it was a largely physical, and more specifically a sexual act of coercion. Rape aims to make the victim's body submit to the rapist's desire. Of course, there's much to be said here, a mountain of important scholarship to acknowledge, but for now, suffice to say that war rape is a political strategy that effectively disturbs and reorganizes social structure by violating the integrity and autonomy of the desiring body. Put differently, war rape does not ask for women's words because it uses her body to speak for the rapist's desire. Or to return to Foucault, we might think of this as an extreme form of political anatomy, a way of conducting politics at the level of flesh and blood and semen. It must be said, however, that this interpretation works against the grain of the ICTY's ruling, which positioned these three defendants as lawless opportunists. That's their phrase, lawless opportunists. In contrast, I want to insist that rape was one of the chief means by which the Yugoslav army attempted to engender a new Serbian nation, and by extension, and as my title is meant to suggest, that this form of sexual violence is a central implement of sovereign power in the time of war. Or one could say in the time of revolution, since Human Rights Watch has more recently issued alarming reports about what they call the epidemic of sexual violence occurring against women in Tahrir Square. Over 4 days of protests that began in June 30th, the latest round of protest, 2013, some 91 cases of sexual assault were reported to officials and activists in Egypt. And in this respect, I would directly challenge Eric on his language yesterday of the emotional flows of assemblage and this kind of discussion about affect that is contentless, that the overcoming of jouissance. Fill in that content with details of what's happening to bodies as a result of affective force, certain bodies. One will find no less harrowing a testimony recorded in Anke Krog's account of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Truly terrifying inventory of all the ways in which men used women's bodies as a terrain of struggle, as Krog cites. The seemingly endless catalog of sexual atrocities should lay bare the irreducible link uniting violence and law, and more specifically the violence that is required to posit law, what Benjamin called law-making violence, the shadowy twin of law-preserving violence of the prison and police. I'm insisting, in other words, on adding this explicitly sexual dimension to our thinking about sovereignty. And perhaps more specifically, I'm suggesting that the principle according to which sovereignty belongs to the law, the nomos, as Giorgio Agamben would describe it, is marked by the enigma of sexual difference, that the logic of sovereignty itself, that point of indistinction between violence and law, the intimate threshold in which violence passes over into law and law passes over into violence, is sexualized. Third point, resituating sexuality as central to human rights would seem to beg for a careful reworking of several of our key concepts, the concepts that anchor this discourse, not least of which is the 100-year-old notion of crimes against humanity. As Hannah Arendt highlighted, crimes against humanity are not just personal crimes committed against particular individuals. More precisely, these are crimes against the human status, which is to say, in some more obscure way, they constitute an attack upon the idea of a shared category of human existence. The ICTY provided a remarkable, if wrenching, new understanding of this grave crime when it accused these three men of rape as a crime against humanity. The court's judgment suggests that in violating another's body, and in particular forcibly penetrating another's interiority, is one of the most intimate and effective ways to erode a sense of a shared humanity, a sense of a shared existence. Rape is a particularly effective means to alienate a subject from their humanity. This is a difficult thought. Rape does not only attack the other's body and mind, but it can also be a form of violence that takes its target the larger idea of a common humanity, and by extension the larger idea of a human subject who possesses the right to limit others' access to their interiority. And also, as an aside, I didn't have time to think too much about it, but this would also, given the landmark ruling, it would also beg us to rethink the notion of dignity. There's already been some really good work. There's a new book out on dignity that's trying to think about the various ways in which it gets mobilized in human rights discourse as something that's inherent to the human, as something that is a status that's attributed, or as a kind of ethics, as a kind of relationality. I think that if we think about the centrality of sexuality, it's going to beg us to rethink this notion of dignity as well. Okay, finally, though not lastly, there is the question of the restorative function of testimony. And as an aside, this is partly an anxious response to Keenan and Weitzman, especially their narrative recently about the evolution of human rights discourse from a focus on documents in Nuremberg to a question of the witness's testimony in Jerusalem during Eichmann's trial, to, as I understand your argument, to be a movement to the focus on the object, to forensic evidence when they dig up Mengel's skull in Brazil in 1985. I know you're putting pressure on that as a telos, but I'm anxious about this turn away from testimony, so I'm going to kind of restage its significance here. The ICTY operated with a different kind of nomos. So here the logic of sovereign power, and the court is a court, make no mistake, it's still sovereign power. But here it turned less on violence than on speech. Through their testimony, witness 87 and Denise, and so many others, communicated their suffering to a human community that was still lacking the capacity to recognize or to reconcile it. This is one of the paradoxes of crimes against humanity. The wrong suffered by the victim constitutes a damage that also entails a loss of the very ability to articulate this damage. When asked how being raped made her feel, witness 87 was at a loss for words, only able to report that it's very difficult for me to describe that. The girl's experience of having her interiority forcibly and repeatedly violated took away her very ability to expressively communicate the nature of this experience to others. This is perhaps a paradigmatic instance of what Jean-François Lyotard calls le différent, the differend. Instances when the testifying statement is deprived of its authority. He says, to the privation constituted by the damage, there is an added impossibility of bringing it to the knowledge of others, and in particular the knowledge of a tribunal. To put that more bluntly, the violence that witness 87 suffered destroyed her ability to speak about the crime. And in this respect, it's worth pausing on those moments when the women's testimony faltered. When this young woman reports, it's very difficult to describe that. How can we speak of that without simply saying it points to an emptiness or to a blank? Undoubtedly, the pronoun refers to an experience that carries great force, something indeed for which no words might be adequate. And yet that is precisely the matter at hand in this tribunal, the nature of the sexual violence that came to be judged a crime against humanity. Part of the tribunal's work was to assign a name, a specific linguistic signifier for what Witness 87 could not describe otherwise, to authorize the legitimacy of the woman's claims by adding its seal of judgment. But apart from the power of the tribunal's gesture of solidarity, it is worth distinguishing this extraordinary force of the testimony itself. For something new occurred at The Hague at the turn of the 21st century, a new understanding of war crimes and of human rights, an understanding born on the back of the sheer courage of these witnesses' efforts to testify to that which they could not name. The fragility of this gesture makes it easy to overlook, but something remarkable happened here. This vulnerable speech, or perhaps it was more simply a bald courage that is required to give breath to such speech, set in motion a community to come, a future international political community in which such acts could be recognized and outlawed. And in this respect, these women's testimonies offered a different kind of suture, a political force, pace, the anatomy that Foucault describes. And in this respect, I'm trying to put pressure on this notion of justice. Justice was not the moment that they were deemed guilty. Everyone wants to say February 22nd, 2001. It was the moment of the women's testimony, because justice, of course, is not simply an action of the law, but as a transformative force in culture. This delicate and contingent courage helped to bind a new community, a new sensus communis, and surely this calls for pause, this vulnerable speech that enabled the world to embrace something for which there was no existing precedence. It allowed for the recognition of that which remains to be said sometimes exceeds what can be presently phrased, for the institution of new idioms into the existing phrase regime, as Lyotard might say. All this, in short, brought about a profound renewal and a revolution in the truest sense of those words, in our very understanding of the human condition. Thank you. I have a cold. It's not just tears lingering.
Are there any comments or questions? See two. I'll take. Is it Ronnie? Right. I'll take Ronnie first, and then I see a third question there as well. Ronnie, please.
Ma question est un peu... Pardon.
I won't be able to understand you very well. Channel 1? I think that's channel 1. Yeah, I got it.
Ma remarque et ma question portent sur la notion de viol comme stratégie de conquête, donc comme crime de guerre organisé. C'est devenu un lieu commun depuis la guerre de Bosnie que les viols au Congo, enfin dans des situations de guerre comme ça, mais je pense particulièrement au Congo, qui est considéré comme l'un des lieux de viol les plus fréquents, les plus massifs. C'est devenu donc un lieu commun que de dire que ça fait partie d'une stratégie globale de prise de pouvoir, de domination, d'abaissement de l'autre. Or, il me semble qu'il y a beaucoup de contre-exemples à ça, qui ne réhabilitent absolument pas le viol, qui ne lui donne aucune lettre de noblesse. Naturellement, ça reste le même acte ignoble, mais qui le détache de cette intentionnalité qui, personnellement, me semble problématique. Je crois qu'en voyant une intentionnalité systématique, et c'est d'ailleurs le terme qui est employé, le caractère systématique, on perd de vue une des dimensions de l'acte guerrier qui est celui d'inverser le statut habituel du droit qui commence par « tu ne tueras point » et qui se renverse en « tu tueras ». la guerre amène ce renversement-là par sa nature même. Et dans ce renversement, on ne peut pas imaginer qu'un renversement se produise tout seul, isolément, de façon insulaire, par rapport au reste des comportements. Et il me semble que donc, dans le sillage de cette inversion du « tu ne tueras point en tu tueras », arrive toute une série de relâchements, d'ouvertures, de potentialités d'expression de nos pulsions les plus ignobles, comme par exemple se servir, utiliser les femmes comme un butin légitime que l'on va employer pour son propre plaisir. Et naturellement, il y a sans doute toute une gradation, il y a des variations individuelles. Mais il me semble que quand on regarde ce qui s'est passé au moment du débarquement américain en France et la campagne de viol qui l'a accompagné, lorsqu'on regarde les lettres que les soldats français écrivaient pendant la guerre de 14, quand ils pensaient arriver à Berlin avant Noël, et qu'ils racontaient à leurs femmes que dès leur arrivée à Berlin, ils ne manqueraient pas de violer autant de femmes qu'ils le pourraient. C'était des lettres privées qu'ils écrivaient à leurs femmes. Lorsqu'on lit ce magnifique livre « Une femme à Berlin », qui raconte l'occupation par l'armée rouge de la zone soviétique à Berlin et des centaines de milliers de viols et des différents types de relations violentes, sexuellement violentes qui se sont produites, on est perplexe devant cette vision très juridico-morale qui est celle produite par les tribunaux pénaux internationaux et disons par le droit humanitaire tel qu'il évolue. Donc ça c'était disons ma remarque critique. Ma question, elle est liée mais un peu différente. Ma question c'est pourquoi est-ce qu'on n'entend pas plus la voix des violeurs ? Parce que le témoignage que vous avez lu, qui était insupportable, en effet, et vous aviez vous-même, je comprends bien, du mal à le supporter, il est inévitablement répétitif. La voix des victimes, les horreurs qu'elles subissent, la voix de la douleur et du sang sont indéfiniment répétitifs et finalement ne nous disent qu'une chose, c'est que l'acte est atroce. Mais on le sait déjà. Ce qui me semble intéressant, c'est de suivre ce que Raoul Hilberg nous invite à faire pour comprendre ce qui s'est passé sous le nazisme, c'est-à-dire à écouter le criminel, qui est le mieux placé pour décrire le crime, ses conditions, et d'une certaine manière ouvrir vers sa logique ensemble. Et donc, est-ce que vous ne croyez pas qu'il serait bon d'interroger les violeurs au Congo, au Rwanda, en Bosnie, dans ces différentes situations où l'on a parlé de crimes de masse, de viols de masse, pardon, pour peut-être déplier un petit peu cette vision qui me semble trop centrée sur une idéologie, une prise de pouvoir. Et puis, dernière remarque, il me semble, que quand Foucault parle de pouvoir, il ne parle pas nécessairement de pouvoir d'État. C'est dans sa conception d'une microphysique de pouvoir, d'une distribution de ce pouvoir dans des différentes instances sociales que c'est à voir. Donc je crois qu'on peut, d'une certaine manière, utiliser Foucault dans le sens que j'indiquais, disons, dans cette direction-là, et pas nécessairement comme une sorte de cadre théorique offert à cette prise de pouvoir et à cette intention criminelle que vous décriviez.
Yes, I agree. I think it would be interesting, and I'm sure there has been work done. And I was thinking of a visual example, actually. There was a series of portraits made in, is it Scott Speedman's book on Rwanda, where a series of portraits were made of the Hutu perpetrators, which was very interesting. They didn't want to speak. They refused to give their testimony. But yes, I do. I agree with you, I think. And I agree with you that there's a long history of work to be done on this topic, where what's fascinating to me about this particular case is that there's a moment in 1914 or 1919 when this discussion is being happening in private correspondence. And then by the time we get to 2001, it's now happening at the level of public tribunal. And we're listening now, which is part of the transformative force, I think, of the nature of this testimonial moment when ideas can be transformed, justice can happen. But I agree, yeah, for sure.
Could you just take the second point around the theoretical framing? I think Roni was
yes,
asking
about Foucault.
Yeah.
I take your point, and I'm having a fight with. It was a kind of a homage to Foucault to stage these two scenes. I was doing a parody, I suppose, or a straight response to him. So I'm using him, and I'm asking. In some ways, I'm saying, we need to do more, and that's on the back of this body of scholarship that I'm leaning, for sure. And if I had more time, I would turn to Foucault's late work and his own transformation of his thinking about the force of the courage for truth, which his notion of, he does a lot of work on the end in press, which is a very important form of speech. And I would say the language of this testimony is that. It's a kind of parousia, it's a kind of courage to speak, despite the danger it might bring in terms of the relationship to your interlocutors. Mm-hmm. And I had a little quibble with Stiegler and his translation of La Vérité as dialectics last night. I think I would insist upon it as a question of truth and the way that Foucault would think of that, but at any rate, that's it.
Okay. There's one question from Rosalind and one behind. If the microphone is near, maybe we could take the one behind first, and then if you go ahead first because you have the microphone. Okay, well, Rosalind can take the question.
First of all, Sharon, thank you so much for that talk. And I think just it was hard to do it. It's kind of hard to ask questions, too, about it. But, and I hate, in a way, to bring up this vexed issue of the image of rape. But if your argument is that the spectacle of rape is integral to power, sovereign power, then how do you treat the images that are, intended to be critical, such as Goya and Dix? Do they contribute then to power in, making it a spectacle, making it an image?
No, I don't think so. I mean, of course, it could. But no, I mean, I was thinking, the other part of my thought as I was going on my ramble aside was Kristeva's beautiful little book on the severed head. Have you seen that? It's lovely.
No, I haven't read it.
Oh, it's good. In the beginning, she has this little anecdote about remembering her mother and how she won young Kristeva she wanted to win, I guess, a contest about the fastest. She had to draw the fastest thing. And her mother drew for her a snowman with its head falling off. And Kristeva was frustrated by that because she was drawing like a jet plane and, but her mother, a smart woman, realized that it's a thought. A thought is the fastest thing in the world. So all that to say that there's a question about the action of making concrete a thought. And so I think that what Dix is doing, what Goya is doing, is that they're thinking about the spectacle of sexual violence. And that operation of thought is an entirely different activity than the material event. It allows, it's not without violence, as language, Derrida points out quite beautifully. Many theorists have pointed out that there is a violence being done, and the same with the court passing judgment. But it's a different operation. It works with a different logic of the relationship between the suturing force of that power So, which is to say that an image doesn't have the same functional operation as does the spectacle of the rape in the social scene. I don't think. That's how I would argue it. But you could persuade me otherwise.
What?
You might be able to persuade me otherwise.
No, I think that's interesting. I just think that it's really complex in terms of what kind of image can avoid contributing to rape culture. Because any image, that involves the female body, is like so problematic, given what your topic of rape, which involves rape fantasy and.
Is this an effort to kind of circulate the logic of the kind of the pleasure of sexual violence, or is it operating in reverse? That's what your question, I think, is aiming at.
It's definitely an effort to criticize it. I mean, definitely, that's the effort. But then how it functions is the problem. The other thing, this is not a question that can be answered right now, but it just
or in the next 300 years.
Exactly, but I just wanted to bring it up. But it also, one other thing, when you were talking about rape, and speech and testimony, that the testimony in some way gave, I don't know if the word reality or something like that, to something that had no name, or gave a name to something that had no name. How does that differ from trauma in general? How would you distinguish rape from trauma in the sense that Kathy Carruth talks about it as something that is not experienced and there's a collapse of understanding? Do you think there's something different with rape?
As I understand, I'm not going to answer your question, but as I understand your question, the hinge of it is going to turn on the movement from the force of the violence to the subject, and as it becomes so the same with the crime against humanity, that's the leap, that it's not against, and that was Arendt's point about the Eichmann trial, that it's not a crime against the Jews. This is a crime against humanity, which is to say it takes its aim, the violence is aimed at the idea of the human, that the Nazis were trying to destroy the idea of the human. And that's a difficult thing to get your head around, because the injury is suffered on the particular body. So I think that's the hinge that you're asking me to make, and it's in the paper. I can't answer.
So that it's not the testimony so much as the designation of rape as a crime against humanity.
But the sort of magic of the testimony is that it allowed for that movement.
It's trauma and something else.
Yeah.
It's trauma and this universal dimension.
Can I think about that?
There's a question behind. Yeah.
Oui, moi j'aurais une autre question, pas sur le viol en soi, mais sur les catégories juridiques. Donc je sais que vous avez travaillé avec ces témoignages de victimes, et moi, par mon expérience, j'ai pu aussi avoir accès à des témoignages de victimes de violences de paramilitaires en Colombie, et je faisais beaucoup le parallèle de ce que racontent ces victimes, de ce qu'elles ont vécu, et comment nous, on peut s'approprier de ce thème avec quelque chose de finalement très aride, comme peut l'être une déclaration d'une victime dans un contexte complètement intimidant, qu'il y a des juges qui doivent rendre un jugement à la fin. C'est pas de la recherche en sciences sociales, ce n'est pas une interview de journaliste, mais c'est un contexte très particulier dans lequel on demandera aux victimes de décrire de façon presque schématique ce qui s'est passé. Et je me demandais comment vous pensez que c'est intéressant de faire des catégories. Est-ce que quand le viol entre dans la catégorie violence sexuelle, est-ce que c'est aussi important est-ce que c'est pertinent de faire une catégorie violence sexuelle, ou il suffirait juste de le classer dans une violence physique et dans une violence psychologique? Est-ce qu'il y a une pertinence exceptionnel parce que, par exemple, quand il y a des tortures, il y a aussi de la violence physique, il y a un viol de l'intimité sans que ce soit précisément une violence sexuelle. Et je me demande si c'est pertinent de créer cette catégorie violence sexuelle ou pas pour des effets de compréhension. Et dans le but du tribunal pénal international, des effets juridiques.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I was arguing. Absolutely, that these small distinctions that were made for the first time between something like torture and rape. The torture as a crime against humanity and rape as a crime against, because of course there's domestic rape, which is another question. So yes, absolutely. That the nature of these, the court's work, I think, is in making these distinctions finer and finer and finer. And that we're getting closer and closer and closer to understanding the logic of the violence in terms of what the violence is trying to do. As Ronnie's point was to say that, a bit of a quibble with the point that it's not a secondary. I'm insisting, and that's the kind of wager of the paper, that sexual difference is at the heart of social breakdown when people are trying to establish themselves as sovereign power, themselves as the grounds of the state, that sexual difference is going to be at the heart of that gesture. So yes, I think that these if I'm understanding your question correctly, that these distinctions are important. And I agree, I mean, to the first comments you were making about what seems like almost like the banality of the testimony at the time. Listening, if you, I don't know if anyone's spent time in a courtroom, and I have, and it's awful. I feel like I'm in Kafka's world, you know, you just want to die and leave as soon as you can, and just, but there's something about, it's like working the same as almost with working in archives. It's because there's a belated effect to the testimony. It's different working with the transcripts.
Peut-être oui. Pardon. Peut-être pour préciser un peu plus ma question, quand je parlais de catégories, est-ce que vous ne pensez pas que le fait de créer des catégories différentes, donc viol, violence sexuelle, violence physique, violence psychique, ne rend pas complexe et peut-être plus inintelligible cette violence tout court ?
No, I don't. I think it asks a lot of us. There's no question. But I think, you know, that's what's demanded. I mean, I'm going to stumble on the word as a scholar. I still haven't quite settled into that position, but, you know, that's the work. That's the work. We're tasked with that work of understanding afterwards. I think it's not easy, and then we have to, you know, work on how to make it effective. But
Merci.
Okay, I see no other questions, and we've also run out of time. So again, Sharon, thank you for a courageous and difficult paper. And I think that concludes our sessions for today. Tomorrow morning, the workshops are from 10 to 11:30, and we start again here at 1:30? 1:30, with Rosalind Deutsch and Olivia Costa, if I remember correctly. I've said that already. Again, just Jamie's just reminded me that if you haven't already registered for the workshops and you want to, please check in with Sabrina, who I think is still at the back. Okay, oh, sorry. Okay, please check in with Jamie. Okay, thank you. And again, thank you, Sharon.